I always just feel bad for the Manders. It's no wonder Norma shoots Irv that dirty look. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. As part of my 2020 13 Nights of Halloween series, today I'm going to be talking about the 1984 sci-fi horror film, Firestarter. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, ranked lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. Firestarter stars David Keith, Drew Barrymore, and George C. Scott, and was directed by Mark L. Lester. Based on Stephen King's 1980 novel of the same name, it tells the story of Charlie, a pyrokinetic girl who's on the run with her father from a government agency that wants to use her powers for nefarious purposes. Here we are, the first review of my second annual 13 Nights of Halloween series. Since this year's theme is Stephen King, I figured what better way to start the series than with Firestarter. As most of you guys already know, I'm a huge Stephen King fan. I started reading his books back when I was in junior high, and even though I had seen some of the movies when I was a kid, that was about the time I really started focusing in on the films as well. But I have a confession. I have not read Firestarter. I had the book. It's been sitting on my shelf for close to 15 years now, but for some reason, I never got around to reading it. And that extended to the movie for quite a while too. I actually only first saw this film about 3 years ago. Now, I used to only watch movies after I had read the book, so I sort of have an excuse there, but I don't really have much of one for not reading the book. I guess I was just under the impression for years that this was a lot more similar to Carrie than it actually is, and that always made me want to read other books first. And there certainly are some similarities to Carrie here, but this story approaches the concept of a girl with pyrokinetic powers in a very different way. I gotta admit though that it still surprises me that Stephen King would write 2 novels with semi-similar fire-starting leads in the span of only 6 years. I mean, it's not a bad thing, it's just always struck me as odd considering the diversity of stories he's created since. In spite of that familiarity, this movie's got a pretty cool premise that draws upon sci-fi thriller elements even more than it does horror. The movie kicks off by just throwing us into the action. We see Andy and Charlie on the run, pursued by carfuls of mysterious figures. Even though we don't know anything about our leads or why they're being chased, we're already fully on their side from the start, and we want them to escape. And as the chase continues, bits and pieces of the backstory get revealed to us through conversations and flashbacks. All of a sudden, it takes on a sort of 60s conspiracy thriller vibe. We've got secret experiments and nefarious government agents and an overwhelming feeling of paranoia. Unfortunately, this really strong concept and potentially unsettling tone get largely squandered here. The pacing of this movie is really poor. You'd think a film whose first half is essentially one big chase would be exciting and energizing, but somehow it manages to be fairly dull. Even during the more exciting first half, there are long stretches of time where characters aren't really doing much of anything, and the constant chasing just gets repetitive, so it's not even all that interesting to watch after a while. And then the second half of this movie just drags. The finale's fun, but everything leading up to it takes twice as long as it should in order to get the information across. I know I haven't read the book yet, but I have a feeling that this is the perfect example of a story that works not because of the plot, but because of the compelling characters and their motivations and thoughts, something that's not the easiest to get across in a movie. Speaking of characters, I personally found it a bit hard to get too deeply invested in any of them here. Andy and Charlie certainly get our sympathy right from the start with the whole on the run from government agents thing, but I can't say that I really liked them. I think my big issue with really all of the characters was their unbelievability in the roles. The bad guys were too over the top in that cliche evil government kind of way, and there was just something off about Andy. At times, the father-daughter relationship felt genuine and heartfelt, but at other times, it took on this weirdly forced feel and came across a little uncomfortable. And Charlie was okay. The character has a few too many whiny, blubbery moments for my tastes, but considering Drew Barrymore was only 8 years old at the time of filming, she does a pretty remarkable job of essentially carrying this film along with David Keith. Firestarter falls into some of the same trappings of many of the other 80s Stephen King adaptations. I already mentioned the less than believable performances, but the film also suffers from some iffy editing and some extremely flat, lifeless cinematography. At times, it feels more like a made-for-TV movie than a theatrically released one, but that's how a lot of the King adaptations from this era have always felt to me. Similarly, it's got some pretty huge doses of melodrama at times, and as influential as Tangerine Dream is to electronic music, their score feels very out of place here, and at odds with the tone of the film, in a way that reminds me of Pet Sematary. I feel like I've been tearing this movie apart, but I do want to say that the actual Firestarter scenes are really exciting and help to alleviate some of the pacing issues I talked about earlier. It doesn't fix them, but watching people get set on fire and cars blowing up does help inject a bit more excitement into the story. Again, it all has that sort of dopey 80s feel to it, but the practical effects are pretty good. And then we've got the finale, which is just insanely over the top. It goes well beyond what we see any time before it, and just escalates to an absurd but satisfying level. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The only real pro is what I was just talking about. The fire scenes. It's probably not a huge surprise that a movie called Firestarter would have some good pyrotechnics, but it's way more enjoyable than you might expect. These scenes really escalate as the movie goes on. The first time we see it happen, it's almost comedic, but by the time we hit the finale, it's full-on horror. Except not quite, because we're on Charlie's side, so it actually feels more like satisfying revenge. But even with the dated, less than stellar execution, the practical fire effects are really great. Even the goofy fireballs end up working in this movie. On the con side, the biggest issue is how dull this movie is. Again, it's kind of weird because the premise should have resulted in a fairly exciting movie. I mean, you've got two people with telekinetic powers on the run from government agents. It's a chase movie, and you've got somebody who can set people on fire, but it doesn't take long for it to feel very tedious. Things get repetitive, and once the chase component of the film's over, it all just gets so dragged out. The movie's just a hair under 2 hours long, and I think this could have easily been cut down to 90 minutes without losing anything important. The second con has to do with the performances, and more precisely, that the characters aren't very believable. I know that might sound like a silly complaint to have in a movie that features a character who can blow up cars with their mind, but there's just something off about most of the performances. Nobody feels like they truly fit the situations they're put into. Everybody's either too flat and wooden, or they're over the top and melodramatic. Really, Drew Barrymore's the only one who comes across sometimes feeling natural, and that's likely due to her age and the fact that she probably wasn't doing that much acting in some of these more intense scenes. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Firestarter or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Firestarter 2.5 out of 5 paws. It's got a good core story and some exciting fire scenes, but it's too dull and largely unmemorable to warrant more than a middle-of-the-road rating. I would recommend Firestarter to fans of sci-fi thrillers and people who like 80s Stephen King adaptations. The premise of this movie is really interesting, so as long as you don't get pulled out of the story due to some of its more dated aspects, you might really enjoy it. It's got a very similar feel to some other King adaptations from this era, so if you're a fan of those, then I imagine this one will be right up your alley too. If you liked Firestarter, I would recommend Carrie. It's probably the most obvious recommendation, considering both films are adaptations of Stephen King novels centered on a girl with pyrokinetic powers, but just about everything else is a bit different. Still though, they're pretty good follow-ups to one another. If you want another Stephen King adaptation with a similar 80s vibe, you might want to check out Pet Sematary. It's more a grief-filled supernatural horror than a sci-fi thriller, but it too features a parent-child relationship at its core and some melodramatic performances. And if you want to venture out of the Stephen King realm, you should try Scanners. It's another sci-fi horror film that features characters who are capable of telekinetic feats and are being sought after by a group that wants to use those powers for their own purposes. It's also got some pretty memorable practical effects. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Firestarter? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite movie that features a kid with special powers? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe or add it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.